The frost came without mercy that October morning, and Harlan Pike used it like a weapon. He stood at the edge of Mara Whitlock's ruined wheat field boots, clean, coat pressed, ledger tucked under one arm, and smiled the way a man smiles when someone else's suffering confirms exactly what he predicted. He hadn't ridden out to help. He'd ridden out to watch, to make sure she saw him watching. His voice carried easily across the frozen stubble when he called out to the two neighbors trailing behind him. 3 years. And she still hasn't learned. A woman alone can't hold this land. Never could. He said it loud enough that Mara, standing 30 feet away, heard every word. She didn't answer him. She'd learned that much. If you've ever stood in a field you've spent everything to save and watched it die anyway, you already know what Mara felt in that moment. And if you've ever had someone arrive just to remind you of your failure, you know why her hands went still at her sides instead of shaking. Before this story is over, that field will mean something none of them expected. That frost will be the beginning of something, not the end. This is your first time here, please subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The wheat was gone. Not struggling, not thinning gone, flattened and blackened by the earliest killing frost anyone in Cutter County, Nebraska could remember in 20 years. Mara Whitlock had watched it happen from the window before dawn, had pressed her forehead against the cold glass, and told herself it wasn't as bad as it looked. By the time she pulled on her coat and walked out to see it properly, she knew that had been a lie she'd told herself to get through the next 5 minutes. She was 34 years old. She had 80 acres, a barn with a wall that leaned the wrong direction, a milk cow named Agnes, who'd been giving less and less since August, 11 chickens, and a debt at Pike's Mercantile that she'd been chipping away at for 3 years and had only managed to reduce by $40. Elias had been dead since the spring of 1881. The farm had been dying slowly ever since, and this frost, this particular October morning felt less like weather and more like a verdict. Harlan Pike arrived an hour after she'd walked the field. She hadn't sent for him. He came because word traveled fast in a small settlement when someone's crop went under overnight, and Harlan Pike traveled fastest of all toward other people's disasters. He had the mercantile, which meant he had the credit, which meant he had a reason to inspect the situation with an air of professional concern that didn't quite hide the satisfaction underneath. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, reining his horse at the fence line. 2 men from town trailed behind him, Deacon Mabry and a young clerk whose name Mara could never remember. Looks like the Lord's seen fit to test you again. She said nothing. That's the last of your winter wheat, I take it. He didn't phrase it as a question. He was reading the field like a balance sheet. It is. And the root cellar? You've got stores? Enough to get through. That was half true. She had 3 bushels of potatoes, 2 crocks of salt pork, some dried beans, and enough cornmeal for perhaps 6 weeks. After that, she wasn't sure. She hadn't let herself think past 6 weeks because the territory beyond that in her mind was dark in a way she didn't want to examine. Harlan Pike wrote something in his ledger. The scratch of his pencil in the cold air was obscene, a small, precise sound that meant her situation was being recorded somewhere permanent. You're 3 months behind on the account, Mrs. Whitlock. I've been patient given the circumstances. But patience has a limit in a business setting. I know what I owe. Then you know I'll need to discuss terms before the month's end. He closed the ledger. You might want to consider whether holding on to this place still makes sense. There are buyers. Wouldn't get you much, but it'd clear the debt. Mara looked at him steadily. She had her mother's eyes, gray and flat and difficult to read, which sometimes worked in her favor. I'll be in before the end of the month, she said. He nodded, clicked his tongue at his horse, and left without another word. Deacon Mabry gave her a sympathetic look over his shoulder that she had no use for whatsoever. She stood alone in the field for another 10 minutes after they rode away. Then she went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying in those first months after Elias died, great heaving ugly cries that left her wrung out and hollow. What she felt now was different, harder, more settled, somewhere between exhausted and resolute. She sat there until the pressure behind her eyes passed. Then she got up and stoked the fire, because the fire always needed stoking, and the work didn't stop because you were frightened. She was bent over the wood stove when she heard the sound. It came from the fence line at the front of the property. Not a knock, but a voice, low and careful, the kind of voice a person uses when they're not sure of their welcome. "Hello? Anyone home?" Mara straightened. She went to the window first. The way a woman alone in a frontier farmhouse always goes to the window first. What she saw made her pause. A man stood at the fence gate. He was tall, but carried himself like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. Slightly folded forward, shoulders up. His coat was wrong for the weather, thin where it should have been thick, the kind of coat that says its owner had come from somewhere warmer and hadn't planned on being this far north. Behind him, half hidden by the fence post, were two children, a boy, maybe 9 or 10, with the serious expression of a child who'd learned not to ask for things, a girl, younger 7, perhaps, holding the boy's hand and watching the house with eyes that were enormous and very dark. Mara looked at them for a long moment. Then she went to the door. The man's name was Caleb Rourke. He told her that immediately before she'd said a word, the way a man tells his name when he wants to demonstrate he has nothing to hide. Up close, he was gaunt in a way that went beyond thin his face, had that particular hollowness that comes not from missing one meal, but from missing many, stretched over weeks. His jaw was set, though. That was what she noticed. He was not a man who was accustomed to asking for things either. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I can see from your field that you've had your own difficulties this morning, and I'm sorry for that. But my children haven't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and I passed 3 farmhouses coming down the road, and all 3 turned us away." He paused. "I'm a builder. I can work. Your barn." He nodded past her, toward the leaning structure visible from the house. "I can fix that, whatever it takes. But right now I need to feed my kids." She looked at the children again. The girl, Elsie, she'd later learn looked back at her without flinching. The boy, Jonah, was staring at the ground in that deliberate way that meant he was aware of exactly how this looked and was trying hard not to care. Mara stepped back from the door. "Come inside," she said. It was the kind of decision that sounds simple in the telling. In the moment, it didn't feel simple at all. She knew what the settlement would say. She'd already had Harlan Pike at her fence that morning, watching for weakness, and now she was about to put a strange man and 2 unknown children in her kitchen. Every practical voice in her head had an objection. She heard all of them and opened the door anyway. She fed them cornmeal mush with salt pork stirred in and 2 of the eggs she'd been rationing. Jonah ate with the careful deliberateness of a child who'd been taught not to eat fast even when he was hungry, which somehow made it worse to watch. Elsie ate the way children eat, when they're truly empty, focused, and silent, completely absorbed. Caleb ate last, after his children, and less than they did. That was the moment Mara made her actual decision. Not when she opened the door that had been impulse and instinct, but watching him take the smaller portion without being asked, watching him check that Elsie had enough before he touched his own bowl. That was when she decided he was someone worth betting on. "You said you can fix the barn," she said, when the bowl was clean. "Yes, ma'am." He looked up. His eyes were brown and tired and direct. "I built 3 structures in Kansas before." He stopped. "I know timber frame construction. What you've got out there is a wall plate failure on the north side, probably from settling combined with last spring's wet. Fixable. Take me 2 weeks. Maybe 3 if the weather's bad." "Where are you coming from?" A pause. Brief but real. "Kansas. Town called Gilmore. We left in August." She waited. He didn't add anything. She didn't push. There was a version of that story she could imagine well enough, and she suspected the specifics weren't what mattered right now. There's a loft above the stove, she said. Enough room for the three of you and warm enough at night if you keep the fire banked. You'll earn your keep on the barn, and I'll feed you while you're working. If you walk off the job, I'll report the debt to the county land office. She said that last part because she needed him to understand she wasn't helpless, even if she was currently desperate. He nodded. That's fair. And your children go to my neighbor Ruth Tanner's house during the day. She runs a school twice a week. I'll arrange it. Something shifted in his face, too quick to name. Yes, ma'am, he said again. Jonah looked up at his father. Caleb caught his eye and gave him a short nod. It's all right. Jonah's expression didn't exactly relax, but it changed. The girl, Elsie, had fallen asleep at the table with her head on her arm, and nobody moved to wake her. The reaction from the settlement came faster than Mara expected. Ruth Tanner arrived the following morning, officially to bring over a jar of put-up tomatoes, and unofficially to see with her own eyes what had moved into Mara Whitlock's loft. Ruth was a kind woman with a talent for delivering concern in the exact tone of friendly conversation, which made it harder to push back on. I'm only saying what people are saying, Ruth told her, standing in the kitchen doorway while Mara kneaded bread. A drifter with children. Nobody knows him. Nobody knows where he came from. He came from Kansas. He says Kansas. Everybody came from somewhere. Caleb Rourke came from Kansas. Ruth glanced toward the barn, where the sound of hammer and chisel had been going since first light. He's working, at least. I'll grant him that. But Harlan says, I know what Harlan says. Mara pushed harder on the dough. Harlan says the same thing about everything that doesn't benefit him directly. I need that barn fixed before winter. Caleb Rourke is fixing it. That's the entire arrangement. Ruth pursed her lips. And the children? The children are fine. The girls slept 12 hours straight the night they arrived. The boy helped me carry firewood this morning without being asked. She looked up. Ruth, they were hungry. I fed them. I'd like to think you'd have done the same. It landed, because Ruth was a decent person at her core. She shifted the tomato jar from one hand to the other. I'd have done the same, she admitted. But I'm not doing it alone. That's the difference. Mara went back to the bread. I've been alone for 3 years. I know how it looks. Ruth left with her concern still visible but quieter. She came back the next day to take Jonah and Elsie to her school session, which was its own form of answer. On the 4th day, Caleb pulled Mara aside after supper. He was holding a rusted iron hinge in one hand. She could see a layer of dried mud on his forearms, and something else beneath that, a particular set to his expression she hadn't seen from him yet. He'd been careful since arriving. Measured. She'd noticed that he chose his words before he said them, that he didn't fill silences, that he watched more than he spoke. This looked different. I need to show you something, he said. She followed him to the barn. He'd been working on the north wall all week pulling rot, reinforcing the sill plate, resetting the posts. That meant digging out the base of the structure, which was how he'd found it. He led her to the northwest corner, where he'd moved aside a section of the earth floor and exposed what looked at first like more wooden supports. Then she saw the edges, the shape of it, a trapdoor set into the ground and framed in timber that was old in a different way than the barn itself, the kind of old that meant it had been there long before Elias ever broke ground on this property. How deep, she said. Deep enough. He pulled back the door. The hinges were stiff but intact, and what came up from below was cold air and something else, the faint, dry scent of wood and cloth and preserved things. He handed her the lantern and let her look. She climbed down 8 wooden steps and stood in an underground room that was perhaps 12 feet by 15. Shelves lined the walls, and on the shelves were canisters and crocks and sacks and tools and small wooden boxes and wrapped packets she hadn't begun to identify. In the corner, in a clay-sealed jar, she found coins. Real money, not paper, coins. Enough to make her chest go tight when she counted them. And beneath a wrapped piece of oilcloth, sitting on the lowest shelf as if it had been waiting quietly for exactly this moment, was a letter. The handwriting was careful and faded, and written by someone who had clearly understood that they would not be there to explain it in person. To whoever finds this place in a time of need, I built this not for myself, but for the trouble I knew was coming. I have watched enough winters on this land to know that the worst one always arrives when you are least prepared. What is here is not mine to keep. It belongs to whoever needs it most when the sky turns against you. Use it well. Share it if you can. There is enough, if you are careful. It was signed with initials only. J.H. Mara didn't know who that was, and she realized she might never know. She stood in that underground room for a long time, with the lantern in one hand and the letter in the other. Then she heard Caleb's voice from above. "You all right down there?" She looked at the shelves around her. She looked at the letter. She looked at the stairs leading back up to a barn that was half rebuilt, and a field that was dead, and a debt at Pike's Mercantile, and a winter she had not, until this morning, been certain she could survive. "Yes," she said, but her voice came out different than she expected. Not frightened, not even relieved. Something else. Something that felt a little like the ground was shifting, slowly, and beginning to tilt back towards solid. She slept badly that night. Not because of the cold, though the cold was real enough, the kind that settled into the corners of the house and made the floorboards contract and pop in the dark like something alive. Not because of the coins still wrapped in her apron pocket, though their weight had occupied a strange corner of her mind all evening. She slept badly because of the letter. Use it well. Share it if you can. There is enough if you are careful. She kept turning those words over, the persons who'd written them. J.H., whoever that was, hadn't known her, hadn't known Elias, hadn't known the wheat, hadn't known Harlan Pike or the debt or the October frost that had finished off the last of what she'd worked 3 years to grow. They'd written for a stranger, in a future they couldn't see, and somehow they'd landed on exactly the right words anyway. That was the part she couldn't stop thinking about. By the time the sky went gray enough to see, she was already dressed. Caleb was awake before her, which she hadn't expected. She found him at the kitchen table, with the letter spread open in front of him and a cup of water at his elbow. Not coffee, because he told Jonah that morning coffee was a luxury they weren't imposing on any, which was the kind of thing a man says when he's been careful not to take more than he's owed. He looked up when she came in. He had the expression of someone who'd been sitting with a question for a while and hadn't arrived at an answer. "Couldn't sleep either," he said, which wasn't what she'd expected him to say. She went to the stove. The fire was already banked up. He'd done that too. She stood with her back to him and said, "We need to talk about what happens next." "Yes," he said. "We do." She turned around. He hadn't moved. His hands were flat on the table, the letter between them, and he was watching her with that direct, measured look that she'd come to recognize as his version of being careful. He didn't perform emotions, this man. He felt them somewhere behind his eyes and let very little of it into his face, unless he'd decided it was safe to. "You didn't tell anyone," she said, "about the cellar. Joan and Elsie don't know yet either, do they? Figured that was your decision to make." She nodded. She'd figured he'd say something like that. The question was what the decision actually was. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and looked at the letter, and she thought about Harlan Pike's ledger and the scratch of his pencil in the cold air, and she thought about the 6 weeks of cornmeal and salt pork she'd been counting on, and she thought about those shelves in the underground room. The sealed canisters, the wrapped packets, the clay-sealed jar of coins heavy enough to clear her debt and still leave something over. "How much is down there?" she said. "Exactly." "Did you inventory it?" "Started to." He reached beside him on the bench and produced a piece of paper she hadn't noticed. He'd been working on it before she came down. The list was handwritten in tight, economical script, organized by shelf. She looked at it. Dried corn, still in the husk. Cured pork, wax-sealed. Smoked fish, wrapped in cloth and still firm when he'd pressed them. Dried beans in canvas bags. Oats stored in iron canisters against the moisture. Root vegetables, turnips. Parsnips packed in dry sand and still solid. Tin of lard. seed packets in oilcloth labeled in faded ink, the tools, hand augers, a draw knife, extra saw blades, things that wouldn't rot. And at the bottom of the list, underlined once, coins, $47.80. Mara read the list twice. She sat back in the chair. Someone spent years on this, she said. Yes, probably more than 1 year. Just left it. For whoever. That's what the letter says. She looked out the window. The sky was coming up, pale and cold, the kind of morning that looked beautiful from inside and merciless from out. Thought about the winter ahead. She thought about Harlan Pike's timeline. She thought about what it meant to have $47.80 in a jar when she'd been calculating the value of a single egg. Then she thought about the letter again. Share it if you can. How bad is the barn? She said. The change of subject didn't throw him. The north wall is the main problem. There's rot in 2 of the sill logs. Once I replace those and reset the corner post, the structure should be sound enough to hold through winter. Maybe 2 weeks of solid work if the weather holds. And if the weather doesn't hold? He paused. Longer. She nodded. She'd been afraid of that answer, which was why she'd asked it. Afraid meant it was real, and real meant she needed to plan for it. I'm not telling anyone about the cellar yet, she said. Not Ruth, not Pike, not anyone. Not until I understand what we have and what we need to keep. He didn't argue. That's sensible. But I'm not hiding it forever. She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence in a way that didn't sound like she was trying to describe herself as a good person, which she found embarrassing. I'll know when it's time, she said instead. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and picked up his cup. All right, he said. Jonah came down from the loft 20 minutes later, with Elsie tucked under his arm. Like a small bird he was keeping warm, her hair loose, and her eyes still half asleep. The boy sat his sister at the table and looked at the stove, then at Caleb, then at Mara. You want me to get eggs? He said. There are only 3 today, she told him. Agnes was restless last night. He nodded, already pulling his coat off the peg. At 9 years old, Jonah Rourke moved through the world like a much older person, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. It was not, Mara thought, entirely a good thing. A child who had learned to make himself useful before he'd been asked was a child who'd learned that his welcome wasn't guaranteed. She watched him go out and thought about that for longer than was comfortable. The week that followed established its own rhythm. Caleb worked on the barn from first light until the cold made the tools too stiff to use properly, usually mid-afternoon, and then he spent the last hours of daylight gathering timber from the woodlot and doing smaller repairs Mara had been putting off for months. A cracked window frame, a gate latch that had never hung properly, corner of the root cellar cover that didn't seal. He didn't ask which jobs needed doing. He walked the property in the early mornings and found them himself, which was both useful and slightly unsettling, because it meant he was paying closer attention than she'd realized. Jonah helped Ruth Tanner with the school sessions on Tuesday and Thursday, and helped Mara the rest of the time. He was strong for his age and quick to learn which tasks he could manage alone. Split kindling with a precision that surprised her, stacked it the way she showed him without being told twice. Elsie followed her father around the barn in the afternoons and had developed a habit of handing him tools before he asked for them, watching his face with that focused seriousness she brought to everything. The community's reaction, meanwhile, had not improved. On Wednesday of the second week, Mara went to Pike's Mercantile for salt and coffee and walked into a conversation that stopped when she opened the door. 4 people. Deacon Mabry, his wife, one of the Hollowell brothers, and a woman named Clara Fenster, whose husband ran the feed mill. They rearranged their expressions quickly. The particular social mechanics of people caught saying something they hadn't intended to be heard, and Clara Fenster said, too brightly, Mara, "How are you getting on?" "Fine," Mara said. She went to the counter and gave Harlan her list. He filled it without meeting her eyes, which was unusual for him. He normally watched her face when he wrote down the quantities as if he was measuring her anxiety against her purchases. "Heard your hired man found something in that old barn of yours," said Hollowell. He said it conversationally, the way a person throws something into water to watch what surfaces. Mara's hand stayed still. "He's rebuilding the north wall," she said. "Found all kinds of things. Rot, mostly." "That's so." He didn't press it, but she felt his attention stay on her while Harlan measured out the coffee. Someone had been watching the property, or someone had been talking. She wasn't sure which, but the question had been too specific. Found something to be idle curiosity. She carried her package out and tied it to the saddle and rode back without stopping to talk to anyone. And when she got home, she went straight to the barn. Caleb was up on the wall, setting a new plate timber. He looked down when she came in. "Someone in town knows something," she said. He came down off the frame. "What did they say?" "Hollowell. He said he heard you found something. He didn't say what." Caleb's jaw tightened. He looked at Jonah, who was nearby sorting timber lengths by size. "Talk to anyone at school?" "About the barn work?" The boy looked up. His face went carefully still in that way he had. "I talked to Mrs. Tanner's boy about the trap door," he said. He asked what I was doing, and I said Pa found a trapdoor under the barn, and we didn't know what was down there yet. He paused. "I didn't say anything about what was inside it. I didn't think that was—" He stopped. His voice was even. You didn't know it mattered. But his eyes, when he looked back at Mara, said something different. They said, "It's going to matter." She made a decision that afternoon. She went down into the cellar by herself with the lantern and the inventory list, and spent 2 hours going through everything properly, opening canisters, checking seals, pressing her thumb into the pork fat to test the cure, counting the seed packets and matching them to the labels. She was methodical about it, the way she'd been methodical about everything since Elias died. No, because being methodical was the thing that had kept her from drowning in the first terrible year. You couldn't always control what came at you, but you could control whether you knew what you had to work with. What she had to work with was more than she'd let herself believe from the list alone. Corn was still viable. She could see it. The beans were dry and clean. The smoked fish were good, wrapped the way someone had clearly learned from experience rather than from guessing. The seeds were the part that made her breath catch, because she recognized some of the variety's drought-resistant strains, the kind of seeds you saved from the best plants of the best years. Someone hadn't just stocked a cellar. Someone had stocked it with intention, with knowledge. She was sitting on the bottom step, reading the seed labels by lamplight, when she heard the barn door above open, and then Caleb's voice saying, "Low and careful, Jonah. Stay here." Then footsteps on the boards. Not Caleb's footsteps. "Hello," a voice she knew. "Deacon Mabry? Mrs. Whitlock?" "Your door was open. Came to see if—" "She's not in the house," Caleb smoothly. "She's seeing to the cow. Can I help you?" A pause. "Heard there's been some discovery out here. The church has a responsibility to the community, and if there are resources that might benefit." "I don't know what you heard," Caleb said. "What I've found is a lot of rotten timber. You want to help? Bring a saw." Marissa sat perfectly still in the cellar. She heard Mabry's uncertain shuffle. Heard him say something about stopping by later to speak with her directly. Heard the barn door close. She waited another full minute before she came up the stairs. Caleb was at the workbench, hands flat on the surface, head down. He looked up when she emerged from the trapdoor. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally. "He'll come back," Caleb said. "I know. And he won't be the only one." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The lamplight between them threw uneven shadows across the new timber framing he'd set that morning, and she could see how much of the wall still needed doing, and she could feel the cold coming in through the gaps, and she thought about the winter and the debt and the $47.80 and the words written in a dead man's careful hand. "I know that too," she said. The days went short and dark, the way October always does in Nebraska, like someone drawing a curtain earlier each afternoon until you barely had time to remember what full daylight looked like. Caleb pushed the work harder as the weather pressed in. She could hear him out there past dark sometimes, moving by lantern light, not because she'd asked him to, but because he was the kind of man who could read a sky and didn't like what he was reading. It was Jonah who brought it up first, 9 years old and sharper than a boy that age had any right to be. He came in from feeding the chickens on a Thursday evening and stopped just inside the door with the look on his face he got when he'd been turning something over for a while and had finally decided to say it. "The sky's been the wrong color," he said. Mara turned from the stove. "What?" "3 nights now, the way it turns at the west." Pa noticed it too. He said the stock were restless, and I said I noticed the color, and he said Jonah stopped, pulled the door shut behind him. He said it looked like Kansas before the big storm in '78. He was 15 then. He said you could feel it in the air a week before it hit. She studied the boy's face. He was not frightened exactly. He was serious, which on Jonah's face was its own distinct expression and harder to dismiss than fear. "Where is your father now?" she said. "Finishing the sill on the northwest corner. He's trying to get it done before." Jonah glanced at the window. The glass was black now, the world outside it invisible. He said he needed 2 more good days. "I don't think we have 2 more good days." She wiped her hands on her apron and went out. Caleb was exactly where Jonah had said, working by lantern hung from a nail on the half-repaired wall. He heard her coming and didn't look up. He was setting the last of the corner logs, moving the way men move when they're working against a clock they haven't told you about. "Jonah told me," she said. He set down the mallet, picked up the lantern, and held it up toward the open gap in the roof where the new boards hadn't gone yet, looking at the sky visible through the hole. She looked too. The stars were wrong somehow, too bright, too hard, the kind of clarity that came just before the air changed. "It's not certain," he said. But I've been smelling the air all week and watching the livestock, and Agnes has been off her feed for 2 days, which isn't the cold. I've seen animals go off their feed before a bad storm. Pressure changes, and they feel it before we do." He lowered the lantern. "The northwest corner isn't finished. The roof has 2 gaps. If what I think is coming hits this barn before those are closed up, we'll lose it." Mara looked at the unfinished wall. At the 2 gaps in the roof she could see from where she stood. She thought about the cellar below her feet, and the winter ahead, and the 11 chickens and Agnes, and the cost of losing everything. "What do you need?" she said. "Time mostly, and lumber. I need 3 more boards for the roof gaps. The ones I pulled from the back wall aren't long enough. Going to ride into town tomorrow." "Go tonight," she said. He blinked. "Pike's will be closed," she said, "but Hollowell keeps lumber at the mill, and he owes me a favor from 2 years ago. I'll write you a note. Take Jonah's horseshoes faster." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was beginning to learn. The one that meant he was recalibrating slightly, that she'd said something that didn't fit whatever he'd expected. "Dark," he said. "I know it's dark." She turned back toward the house. "I'll write the note." He went, and she spent the 2 hours he was gone doing what she could by lantern, repositioning the animals as far from the unfinished north wall as the barn allowed, checking the lashings on the older timbers, moving the small crates of stored grain that had been sitting against the base of that wall. Elsie came out in her coat to help, quiet and purposeful, holding the lantern when Mara needed 2 hands without being asked. At one point, Mara looked down at the girl's face, 7 years old and completely concentrated on the task, and thought about what it must be like to be Elsie Rourke, to have spent enough time in uncertain places that helping an adult prepare for an emergency felt like ordinary life. She wanted to say something to her. She didn't know what. Caleb came back with the lumber at 9:30. Hollowell's note of confirmation tucked in his coat. He and Mara worked until past midnight, closing the roof gaps by lamplight, Caleb on the frame, and Mara below passing boards and holding the lantern steady when the wind started coming up. It was not warm work. By the end, her hands were stiff, and her back was a solid complaint from shoulder to hip, and she'd put a nail through the side of her thumb that was going to be unpleasant for a week. The roof was closed. They stood in the barn in the middle of the night, with the lanterns burning and the animals restless in their stalls and the wind picking up outside. And Mara looked at the patched roof and the set northwest corner and the walls that were still imperfect, still showing the marks of everything they'd been through, but were standing. "How long do we have?" she said. Caleb tilted his head, listening to the wind. "Maybe 3 days. Maybe less." He looked at her. "We need to think about the neighbors." She knew what he meant. She'd been not thinking about it for days, same way she'd been not thinking about certain things since Elias died, not because she'd decided against them, but because thinking about them required something she hadn't been ready to spend. "If the storm is as bad as you think," she said slowly, "some of them won't have enough. Some of them definitely won't." The Hollowell family's stores were already short last month. His wife mentioned it to Jonah when the kids were picking up supplies. The widow Crane on the East Road is older and alone. The Mabry family has 5 children. Mara was quiet for a moment. Deacon Mabry, who had come to her barn asking about resources that might benefit the community, and she had hidden in a cellar while Caleb turned him away. She thought about that. "There's enough in the cellar," she said. It wasn't a question exactly. She was saying it out loud to see how it sounded. "There's enough for more than the 2 of us," Caleb said carefully. "What you do with that is your decision." "It's not my cellar," she said. "That's the thing. It was never my cellar. Someone built it and left it for whoever needed it." He didn't say anything. He was letting her get there on her own, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. "Storm comes," she said. "We ride it out. And if it's bad when it's bad, the cellar becomes whatever the settlement needs it to be." She looked at him. "But nobody knows about it yet. Not until the storm hits. Because the moment people know before the storm, we'll have half the county at the door and nothing left to manage it with." "Agreed," he said immediately. "And we need to be smarter about the supply. If we're feeding multiple families, we need to know exactly what we have and how far it stretches. No waste. No panic distribution. I can help with that. I know you can." She picked up her lantern. Her thumb was throbbing. Her back was going to be screaming by morning. "Get some sleep," she said. "We've got 3 days and a lot to do." She was almost to the barn door when he said, "Mara." It was the first time he'd used her name without the missus in front of it. She paused. The letter said someone built it for desperate times. He was still standing in the middle of the barn, lantern in hand, looking at her. "I think the person who wrote that would be glad about what you just decided." She thought about that for a long moment. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe they'd just be glad the roof got fixed before the snow." She went inside. She lay down. She did not sleep, but this time the not sleeping felt differentless, like dread, and more like the particular wakefulness of someone who has made a decision and is living in the hours before it becomes real. Outside, the wind picked up steadily through the small hours, moving from a whisper to something with more weight behind it. The livestock shifted in the barn. Agnes made the low sound she made when she was uncomfortable. Somewhere far to the northwest, the sky was doing something that Caleb Rourke recognized and had been afraid of since the moment he first read it 3 days ago in the color of the evening air. By morning, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and Jonah, who had been watching the sky from the loft window in the gray pre-dawn light, the way his father had taught him, came down the ladder and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "It's coming." So the strange thing was that even as Mara stood at the kitchen window and watched the first tentative shift in the clouds far to the west, that flat, almost greenish underlit gray, that meant something serious was building. She felt less afraid than she had in weeks. Not because the danger wasn't real. Because for the first time since Elias died, she wasn't facing it alone. And because underneath the barn floor, in a room that someone had built with more faith than she'd ever managed, there was enough. They were careful, if they were wise about it, if they did what the letter asked. She turned from the window and started heating a for the morning oats. There was a lot to do before the sky made up its mind, and she had learned, in 3 hard years on this land, that the time between knowing trouble was coming and trouble arriving was not time to spend on fear, time to get ready. The storm did not arrive the way storms are supposed to arrive, with warning enough to feel prepared, with a gradual building that gives you time to finish the last thing on the list. It arrived the way the worst things in life arrive, faster than expected, and from a direction you hadn't quite accounted for. The morning of the third day after Jonah's quiet announcement, Mara woke to a silence so complete it felt wrong. No wind, no creak of the house settling, no distant sound of anything. Just a held, pressurized quiet that sat over the land like a hand pressed flat. She lay still for 30 seconds, listening to it, and then she was out of bed and at the window before she'd fully decided to move. The sky to the northwest was the color of a bruise going bad. She dressed in the dark and went downstairs. Caleb was already at the table, coat on, hands around a cup. He'd slept in the barn the last 2 nights to be near the animals, and the fact that he was in the house now told her something. How long, she said. Hours, not days. He looked at her over the cup. Maybe less than hours. She thought about what wasn't done. The widow Crane on the East Road. She'd sent Jonah over yesterday with a covered basket of meal and salt pork and a note telling her to stay inside. But she hadn't actually spoken to the woman herself, hadn't confirmed she had enough fuel. The Mabry family had been told nothing. The Hollowell brothers had been told nothing. She had kept the secret because keeping the secret had been the right call up until this moment, and now this moment had arrived, and the secret had to end. I need to ride to Crane's, she said. No, he said it flatly. No softening. Listen to that sky, Mara. You ride out now, you may not make it back before it hits. She's alone. She got your basket yesterday. She knows to stay in. He stood up. What we need to do right now is make sure this place is ready to be a refuge, because that's what it's going to be in about 4 hours, whether we're ready or not. He paused. People are going to show up here. We both know that. When they can't get anywhere else, they'll come to the barn that has a light in it. We need to be ready. She wanted to argue. The widow Crane was 63 years old and had a chimney that didn't draw well, and a woodpile Mara hadn't personally verified. But Caleb was right, and she knew he was right, and being right about an unpleasant thing didn't make it any easier to accept. Fine, she said. Tell me what needs doing. They worked through the morning with the systematic urgency of people who've done this kind of preparation before, or who are smart enough to move like they have. Caleb reinforced the barn's interior, bracing with the extra timber he'd kept aside, crossing the supports on the weakest panels, and driving the stakes deeper into the frozen ground. Mara brought the remaining cellar supplies up in organized batches and arranged them against the barn's interior wall. Not all of them, not recklessly, but enough that she could distribute quickly without making 10 trips down the stairs in a crisis. She wrapped the seed packets in an extra layer of oilcloth and moved them to the highest shelf in the cellar, because seeds were the future, and the future needed protecting even when the present was the problem. Jonah managed the animals without being asked, moving Agnes and the 2 older horses into the reinforced center stalls, securing the chickens, laying extra straw against the walls. He worked with an economy of motion that made him look older than 9, and made Mara think again, uncomfortably, about what kind of childhood produced that particular quality of self-sufficiency. Elsie filled every available container with water from the pump before it could freeze. 7 years old, carrying a bucket almost as big as her torso, back and forth, without complaint or comment. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped another 8 degrees. By noon, the sky had gone from bruise-colored to the particular shade of white-gray that means business, the kind of sky that flattens the landscape and removes all sense of distance. The wind started coming up around 1 in the afternoon. Not a gust, but a steady push from the northwest that leaned against the barn walls and didn't let up. And then, at 20 past 1, the first flake fell. Mara was at the barn door when it happened. She watched it land on her sleeve, flat and perfect crystal the size of a shirt button, and before she could look up there were 10 more, then 20. Then the air was simply full of them, in a way that seemed less like weather and more like the sky had decided all at once to come down. Within 30 minutes, she couldn't see the house from the barn. The first neighbors arrived at 2 o'clock. Not who she'd expected. It was the Hollowell brothers, both of them. The older one, with a gash on his forehead from something she didn't ask about, leading their 2 horses through snow that was already at their boots. They'd lost a section of their own barn roof in the first serious gust, and they'd come because they had nowhere else to go and the light was on in Mara Whitlock's barn. "You've got room," the older Wandale asked. He was standing in her barn doorway with snow packed against his shoulders, looking at the reinforced interior with an expression she couldn't read. "I've got room," she said. "Get your horses in." They came in. They looked at the organized supplies against the wall with undisguised curiosity, but had the decency not to ask immediately. Caleb came around from the north side of the barn where he'd been driving in the last of the extra steaks and introduced himself with a handshake, which seemed to surprise Dale Hollowell. He'd clearly been expecting more wariness from the drifter he'd been hearing about in town. Caleb just shook his hand and pointed at the second stall and told him the horse would be fine there, and Dale Hollowell nodded and led the animal in without another word. The Mabry family arrived 40 minutes later, all 7 of them, Deacon Mabry and his wife Sarah, and their 5 children in a wagon that barely made it through the snow building on the road, the wheels cutting deep and the horse struggling. 2 of the children were crying. The youngest, a girl of maybe 4, had her face buried in her mother's coat and wasn't making any sound at all, which was worse. Sarah Mabry came in and immediately went to Elsie, who was sitting near the lamp with a piece of rope she'd been turning into something, a practice knot. Caleb had been teaching her and said, with the directness of a practical woman, "You're Rourke's girl, you all right?" Elsie said yes, and Sarah nodded and pulled her own children into the next circle of lamplight. Deacon Mabry stood before Mara with snow melting off his hat and said, "Mrs. Whitlock, we owe you an apology." She looked at him. He was a man who found apologies physically uncomfortable. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the slight forward lean that was either humility or the posture of someone braced for pushback. "We were unkind about your arrangements," he said. "About Mr. Rourke. We said things we shouldn't have said." "Yes," Mara said. "You did." He blinked slightly. He'd been expecting her to smooth it over, she could tell. She didn't feel like smoothing it over. She also didn't feel like dwelling on it, because there were more important things happening. "You're welcome here," she said. "Same as anyone." Then she told him about the cellar. She hadn't planned to tell it in quite that way, gathered in the middle of the barn, with snow drumming on the roof, and the Hollowell brothers listening, and Sarah Mabry's children pressed close. But there was no clean way to reveal it, no private moment that was going to present itself, and people needed to know what they had access to so they could stop being afraid. She told it plainly. The trapdoor under the barn floor, the shelves, the supplies, the letter from J.H., whoever that was, written for exactly this kind of moment. She didn't editorialize. She didn't make it dramatic. She just told them what was there, and that it was available, and that she intended to manage it carefully so it would last as long as it needed to last. The silence after she finished was the particular kind that happens when people are revising their understanding of a situation. Dale Hollowell was the first one to speak. "How long have you known?" he said. 11 days. He absorbed that. She could see him working through what it meant. That she'd known, that she hadn't told anyone, that she was telling them now because the storm had made the secret irrelevant. "You could have kept it," he said. Not accusatory, exactly. More like he was noting a fact. "I could have," she said. "That's not what it was put there for." Another silence. Then Sarah Mabry said quietly, "Is it enough?" "If we're careful," Mara said. The storm hit its full force around 4 in the afternoon, and what had been serious became something else entirely. The wind came off the northwest at a sustained howl that the barn walls absorbed unevenly. You could feel the pressure building on the north face in particular, a vibration in the timber frame that Mara felt through her boots when she stood near the wall. Outside, the snow was no longer falling so much as moving horizontally, driving sheets of it that would have knocked a person down if they'd been standing in it. Visibility from the barn door was perhaps 6 feet, maybe less. They lost power over the house completely when the wind took us a section of the fence and sent it into the kitchen window shortly before dark. No one was in there at the time, but the sound of it, the crash and the subsequent whistle of the storm through the gap was bad enough to hear from the barn. Mara went in with Caleb to seal the window with boards from the woodpile, and they worked in the dark of the kitchen, with the wind coming straight through the gap, and it took both of them pushing together to get the board up against the opening and hold it long enough for Caleb to drive the nails in. When they were done, they stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, just breathing. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She wasn't going to say anything else, and then she said, "It's going to be a long night." "Yes," he agreed. "But the barn holds." They went back. Inside the barn, with 8 adults and children crowded into the lamplight, and the animals shifting and the storm working at the walls from outside, there was a quality of enforced intimacy that stripped away some of the social distances that would have existed in normal circumstances. Sarah Mabry's youngest finally came out of her coat and accepted a cup of warm broth from Mara's hands without making eye contact. Dale Hollowell's younger brother, who had barely spoken since arriving, sat down to Sejona and started asking him questions about the construction work, the way men sometimes find comfort in talking about how things are built. Elsie fell asleep against her father's shoulder. After supper, her practice knot still in her hand, and Caleb shifted carefully so she wouldn't fall without waking her. Mara managed the cellar supplies the way she'd said she would, carefully, deliberately, no more at a time than was needed. She kept track of what went out in a notebook she found in Elias's old desk, the one she'd never been able to bring herself to use for anything after he died. She used it now. Names, quantities, dates. It felt right. The first night passed. It was not comfortable. The barn was warm enough to be survivable, but not enough to be called warm breath fogged. Children slept in layers. The adults traded off, keeping the fire in the small iron stove, going that Caleb had moved in from the house on the first day of preparation. Agnes was restless until around midnight, then settled. The chickens were quieter than usual, huddled together, which meant they were conserving heat, which meant the temperature in their corner of the barn had dropped more than she'd like. On the second morning, the storm had not broken. The wind had dropped slightly enough to make the barn quieter, not enough to make outside survivable. The snow against the base of the north wall was visible through a crack in the lower boards, packed tight by the wind into a solid mass. Caleb checked every joint on that wall twice in the morning and found 3 that had moved more than he liked. He redrove the stakes on 2 of them and called the 3rd acceptable. Acceptable how? Mara said, looking at the joint in question. "It'll hold if the wind doesn't shift south. And if it shifts south?" He looked at her steadily. "Then we have a problem with that corner." He looked at the corner. She looked at the children sleeping in the lamplight 20 feet away. She looked at the 2 families who had come here because her barn had a light in it and because they'd had nowhere else to go. She did not say what she was thinking, which was, this cannot be the place that fails them. The second day brought more arrivals. They came in the gaps between the worst gusts. A man named Garrett Cole, who had been trying to make it to his brother's place when his horse refused to go any further and had followed the faint glow of the barn lantern through the white. A young mother named Nettie Frost, barely 20, with an infant and a face that was so comprehensively exhausted that Mara didn't ask questions, just put her near the stove and handed her the broth and told her to sit down before she fell down. Nettie looked at her with an expression that was almost nothing, just the flat affect of someone who had spent everything they had getting through the last few hours. And then something moved in her face, and she sat down and drank the broth and did not speak for a long time. Garrett Cole looked at the organized supplies against the wall, and then at Caleb, and then at Mara, and said, "Is this Whitlock's place? I heard there was a woman out here who..." He stopped talking. Before the storm hit, People were talking about something on this property. Sit down, Mara said. I'll explain. She was getting better at explaining it. The second time, through the story of J.H., the cellar, and the letter, she found the shape of it more clearly, not as a remarkable thing that had happened to her, but as a remarkable thing that someone had done long before she arrived, that she was now the instrument of completing. That distinction mattered. She could feel it mattering as she spoke. Garrett Cole listened with his hands on his knees. When she finished, he said, $47. In a jar? Coins are not for distribution, she said immediately, and with a firmness that surprised even her. Those are the farm's future. Everything else we share. Coins are how this land survives after the storm. He nodded. He seemed like a reasonable man. She was grateful for that. By the second evening, there were 14 people in the barn. Mara had gone through her notebook 3 times, recalculating. The storm broke by the third day, which Caleb thought was likely, though not certain. She had enough. If it ran to 5 days, she'd need to be more careful with the portions. If it ran longer than 5 days, she was going to have to make harder choices. She didn't tell anyone this. She kept it in her head and recalculated in the notebook, and kept her face as even as she could manage. Caleb watched her do this without commenting. In the late afternoon of the second day, when most of the others were occupied, he came and sat beside her on the feed crate she'd been using as a makeshift desk. "You're not sleeping," he said. "Neither are you. I'm not carrying the ledger in my head." He glanced at the notebook. "What are we doing?" "We're all right if it breaks by day 3. She paused. "We're all right if I'm careful. I'm being careful." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, Mara, you can't control the storm's length. I know. And the people in here, they're not going to leave if things get tight. They'll just be frightened. I know that too. So what I'm saying is," he stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words with more deliberateness than usual. "You are doing everything right, and some of what happens is still going to be out of your hands. And that's not a failure of planning. It's just weather." She looked at him. He was serious and tired, and his coat had a tear in the right shoulder from where he'd caught it on something the day before, and hadn't stopped to fix it. He was not saying this to make her feel better. He was saying it because it was accurate, and he was the kind of man who said accurate things. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to say it. I know that, too." The third day arrived, with a sound that was different. Not quiet, not the eerie silence of the storm's approach, but changed, the wind dropping to something intermittent rather than sustained. Caleb woke at first light and went to the barn door and pressed his ear against it and came back and said,
"It's breaking."
Not broken yet, but breaking. The relief in the barn was palpable and physical, like a change in air pressure. People sat up straighter. The Mabry children, who had been subdued and solemn for 2 days, started to fight over something small and stupid, and Mara found herself absurdly grateful for the sound of it. She was in the middle of organizing the morning distribution when Jonah appeared at her elbow. He had been everywhere useful throughout the storm-moving supplies, tending the stove, keeping the younger children occupied with invented games, and she had stopped being surprised by his presence at the exact moment he was needed. "The north corner," he said, quietly, not frightened, just informational. She turned, she looked, and she felt it before she fully saw it, the slight movement in the wall frame that hadn't been there an hour ago, the 3-inch gap that Caleb had called acceptable now showing something different. The wind, which had been dropping, had shifted in the night. The south was up. She was moving before she'd finished the thought. Caleb. He was already there. He'd seen it. He had a support timber in his hand, and he was angling it toward the corner with the focus of a man who was calculating stress and force and time all at once, and she could see from the way he was moving faster than his usual measured pace that this was not merely concerning. This was urgent. "Get the children away from that wall," he said. "All of them now." She turned and did it without drama, which required more composure than she felt. Calmly, "Mo, that everyone should move to the south end. There was a structural adjustment happening, and it was better to have space. Sarah Mabry read her face with the accuracy of a woman who had been watching Mara Whitlock manage this situation for 2 days and understood more than she was being told. She moved her children efficiently and without creating panic, and Mara could have kissed her for it. The wall held a groan that everyone heard. Garrett Cole was on his feet. The Hollowell brothers came forward instinctively, because both of them had built things, and both of them could see what was happening. "Tell us what to do," Dale Hollowell said. Caleb told him. He spoke in the quick, precise way of a man who knows what needs to happen and doesn't have time to explain why. "Get the secondary post, the one against the east wall. Bring it here. Hold it at this angle. Don't let it move." He positioned Dale Hollowell's brother against one support and Garrett Cole against another, and worked the main brace himself, driving it with the mallet in long, powerful strokes that Mara could feel through the barn floor. The wind hit the north wall from the south-shifted angle, and the corner groaned again louder. This time, a full-body sound from the timber that meant the stress was real and increasing. Caleb drove the last stake, and then something happened that Mara would remember for the rest of her life. Not because it was dramatic, but because of how close it was. The corner above the repaired joint shifted visibly, a full inch of movement in the frame, and the roof above it sagged and then caught, held by the angled brace Caleb had set in the last 30 seconds, and everything went still. Not quiet. The wind was still working at the walls, still pressing, still looking for the weak place. But the corner held, the brace held, the joint held. Nobody spoke for about 10 seconds. Caleb lowered the mallet. He was breathing hard. There was blood on his right hand from where the mallet handle had caught the skin during one of the driving strokes, and he hadn't seemed to notice it. "It's holding," he said. "It's holding," Dale Hollowell agreed. His voice was different than before, quieter. Mara had crossed the barn without deciding to. She was standing at the corner, looking at the joint, at the brace, Celsius, at the slight sag in the roof above that had decided not to become a collapse. And she was aware that her hands were shaking slightly inside her gloves, and that there was nothing she was going to do about that. Caleb saw her hands. He didn't say anything. He put his own hand, the one that was bleeding briefly, over both of hers, just for a second. Then he let go and turned to check the other joints. She stood there for a moment. Then she turned around and went back to the notebook and the careful, necessary mathematics of feeding 14 people through the end of a storm. Outside, the wind was changing again, losing its south component, going back to northwest, diminishing in the way that meant the engine of it was running out of fuel. Snow against the base of the wall was deep enough to see above the gap in the lower boards, which meant it was deep enough to be serious when they finally opened the door and had to deal with the world outside. That was tomorrow's problem. Tonight the barn held. The lamp stayed lit. Sarah Mabry's youngest was finally sleeping, without someone holding her, which meant she felt safe enough to stop guarding herself. Elsie was teaching the older Mabry boys the practice knot her father had shown her, walking them through it with the grave patience of a child who has recently learned something and wants to make sure the knowledge doesn't stop with her. And Mara sat with her notebook in her lap and her back against the feed crates and watched the people in her barn. This collection of frightened, imperfect, complicated people who had shown up with their panic and their horses and their 5 children and their unspoken apologies, and who were still here, still breathing, still intact. And she thought about the person who had written the letter, J.H., with their careful handwriting and their years of preparation and their absolute certainty that someday someone would need exactly this. She thought about what it takes to believe in a future you can't see, to build something for a stranger you'll never meet, to trust that the trouble you're preparing for is worth preparing for, even when you have to do it alone. She understood that person better tonight than she had 11 days ago when she'd stood in that underground room with the lantern and the letter and felt the ground beginning to tilt back towards solid. The 4th night of the storm was quieter than the 3 before it. Not over, but quieter. And in the barn that should have failed but hadn't, in the lamplight that had guided people through the white and into the warmth, 14 human beings settled into the uneasy half-sleep of people who have been frightened for long enough that the absence of new crisis almost feels like peace. The wind dropped another hour before dawn, and this time it did not come back up. The silence that followed the storm was the loudest thing Mara had heard in 4 days. She noticed it before she was fully awake, that particular absence of wind sound that her body had been braced against. So long it had stopped registering as noise and become instead the baseline of the world. When it stopped, the stopping woke her up faster than any sound could have. She lay still for a moment, on the straw pallet she'd moved onto 2 nights ago, to give the Mabry children more room on the boards, listening to the quality of the quiet, testing it. It held. She sat up. Around her in the lamplight, they'd kept one lamp burning through the nights. Rationing the oil carefully, people were sleeping in various states of discomfort. Sarah Mabry was upright against the wall, with her youngest daughter across her lap, head tipped back, mouth open, deeply unconscious, in the way that means the body has finally stopped fighting. Dale Hollowell and his brother were stretched on opposite sides of the south stall with their coats over them. Garrett Cole was a bundled shape near the stove. Nettie Frost had her infant tucked against her chest and was the only other person awake. She looked at Mara across the barn with the steady, tired eyes of a young mother who'd been measuring the storm sounds all night for different reasons. Caleb was at the north corner. Still, he was sitting with his back against the repaired post, eyes closed, but she knew from the quality of his stillness that he wasn't sleeping. He was listening the same way she'd been, running the silence through some internal meter. He opened his eyes and looked at her. "It's done," he said. Not a question, a reading. She nodded. Then she got up, pulled on her boots, and went to the barn door. She had to push twice before it gave. Snow had packed against the base overnight, a solid resistance that required her shoulder in it before it broke. And then she was standing in the doorway with the cold coming off the world in a clean, knife-edged wave, and she looked out at what the storm had left. The world was white and completely rearranged. Where the fence line should have been, there was a uniform drift 4 feet high. The road was gone. Not drifted over, but simply invisible. The landscape flattened into a continuity of white that made it impossible to tell where the yard ended and the fields began. The kitchen window she and Caleb had boarded up from the inside was visible, the boards dark against the house's pale wall, a reminder of how bad the third night had been. One section of the chicken run was down. The gate to the woodlot was buried past its upper rail. She stood there for a full minute, just taking inventory. The barn was still standing. That was the thing her eyes kept coming back to. Every other structure on the property showed some damage. The house, the run, the gate. But the barn, the improbable, half-repaired, ramshackle barn that a gaunt man from Kansas had spent 3 weeks rebuilding before a storm arrived to test his work. The barn was standing square and solid, exactly where it was supposed to be. She heard movement behind her, and Caleb came to stand beside her in the doorway. He looked at the same thing she'd been looking at, in roughly the same order. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "The chicken run," he said finally. "I see it. I can fix it today if the cold holds off." "Cold isn't going to hold off," he agreed. "But I can fix it fast," she almost smiled. There was something about this man. His Sam's absolute refusal to catalog disaster without immediately moving to remedy, his brain's instinct to skip from problem to solution, without lingering in the territory of "isn't this terrible," that she had come to find more stabilizing than she'd ever expected another person's presence to be. They turned back inside together. The waking of 14 people in a barn after 4 days of emergency proximity had its own particular texture. It was not graceful. Children emerged from sleep mean and disoriented, the way children do when they've been frightened for too long. Sarah Mazabre's older boy said something to the Hollowell brother that got a sharp word back, and Sarah intervened with the tired authority of a woman running on 4 hours of broken sleep. Nettie Froz's infant cried for 40 minutes straight, a thin, reedy sound that was perfectly designed by nature to make everyone in earshot uncomfortable. Garrett Cole burned his hand on the stove iron, checking if it was hot enough, swore, and then apologized to the room, with the formality of a man aware he was a guest. Mara fed everyone from the morning's portion, calculated the night before, recorded in the notebook, and began thinking about what happened next. Because what happened next was the problem she hadn't let herself dwell on during the storm, the problem she'd been holding at arm's length because the storm itself demanded all the attention available. And now the storm was over, and the problem was right there, waiting. These people needed to go home, and home, for most of them, was going to be catastrophic. She knew this before anyone said it. She'd heard enough to piece together the situation from 2 days of conversation in close quarters. The Hollowell brothers had lost their barn roof. That meant exposed stock, which meant losses. Deacon Mabry's root cellar had been improperly sealed since September, which Sarah had mentioned once, without seeming to realize the significance. If water had gotten in before the freeze, they'd come home to rot. Garrett Cole had been on his way to his brother's place, for a reason he'd been vague about, and the vagueness suggested the reason wasn't good. Nettie Frost hadn't said where she was going before the storm caught her, only that she'd been moving. And the infant in her arms said there was a situation there more complicated than weather. Deacon Mabry was the first one to say it out loud. He came and stood beside Mara while she was calculating the morning's distribution and said, quietly, so the children wouldn't hear, "I'm afraid of what we'll find at the house." She looked at him. He was a proud man. She'd always found him difficult, his blend of self-importance and genuine faith, creating a persona that was hard to like, even when she believed his intentions were decent. He did not look proud this morning. He looked like a man who had spent 4 days watching someone else manage a crisis that his own failures had contributed to, and was arriving at conclusions he didn't enjoy. "How bad was the seal on your root cellar?" she said. He paused. "My wife thinks it's all right. She was there when I did it. She's more optimistic than I am about my work, generally. She's a sensible woman, she is." "It was quiet, Mrs. Whitlock. I said things about you and Mr. Rourke that I shouldn't have said. I said them to people who repeated them. I know that made your situation harder, and I want to be direct about that." She kept her eyes on the notebook. "You already apologized." "I know, but I want to be specific." He's exhaled. "I told Harlan Pike that you had poor judgment. After the storm, he's going to have questions about why your barn is standing when half the township is flattened. I want you to know that whatever I can do to—" He stopped. "Owe you that." She looked up at him then. He was serious and uncomfortable with his seriousness, and she believed him. "Don't do anything about Harlan Pike," she said. "I'll handle Harlan Pike." He blinked. "He's going to come out here, Mara." "I know." She turned back to the notebook. Let him come. The exodus from the barn happened gradually, over the course of the morning. The Hollowell brothers left first, leading their horses through the drifts toward their property with the grim efficiency of men who needed to see the damage before they could do anything about the feeling of it. Garrett Cole left next, still without fully explaining where he was going, but he shook Caleb's hand at the door and then came back and shook Mara's, which she hadn't expected, and said, "I'll tell people what this place was," which she understood to be a specific kind of currency being offered and accepted. Deacon Mabry loaded his family into the wagon slowly and carefully. Sarah Mabry came to Mara before she climbed up and held both her hands in the way that women do when they mean something that doesn't have a short word. "Whatever he owes you," Sarah said, meaning her husband. "So I want you to collect it." "He doesn't owe me anything," Mara said. "He does. We all do." She squeezed once and let go, but especially him. The last to leave was Nettie Frost, and only because Mara wouldn't let her go sooner. The girl, she was barely more than a girl. Mara had decided maybe 21 at the outside had nowhere specific to go. That was what emerged in pieces over 2 cups of tea at the kitchen table, while Caleb fixed the chicken run outside, and Elsie sat with the infant, so Nettie's arms could rest. She'd been staying with a cousin's family east of the settlement, had fought with the cousin's husband over something she only described as a misunderstanding that wasn't, it doesn't, and had been heading west with the baby when the storm caught her. "Where were you heading?" Mara said. "Anywhere that wasn't there," Nettie said. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. Mara sat with that for a moment. She thought about what it meant to be a young woman in the Nebraska Territory with an infant and no specific destination, the arithmetic of that situation, which was not favorable. "I know a woman in Callaway who takes in boarders," she said. "Decent place. She's helped people in complicated situations before. I'll write you a letter." Nettie looked at her. Something shifted in her face, not gratitude exactly, more like the expression of someone who expected to keep solving a problem alone and has been surprised by an unexpected variable. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you kept that baby quiet for 4 days in a barn with 13 other people and a storm. That's enough." Nettie looked at the infant in Elsie's arms and then back at Mara. "All right," she said. Quietly, Mara wrote the letter. She wrote it carefully, the way she wrote everything. No embellishment, just the necessary facts arranged in the most useful order. When Nettie Frost left an hour later, the letter was in her coat pocket, and there was a wrapped parcel of dried meal and salt pork tied to her horse's saddle, enough for several days, removed from the cellar stores that Mara was keeping meticulous track of. Jonah held the baby while Nettie mounted, and then passed him up with the careful competence of a 9-year-old who had been doing useful things around adults for long enough to know how to hand a baby safely to a woman on horseback. Mara stood at the fence and watched Nettie ride east and thought about the letter in J. H. Careful hand. Use it well. Share it if you can. She was trying. She thought that was all you could do, try, and keep track, and not pretend it was simple. Quiet that followed. Everyone's departure was the first genuine quiet in 4 days, and it had a different texture than the pre-storm silence that had been pressurized, anticipatory. This was what remained after something had happened and finished, the quiet of aftermath, which has its own particular weight. Mara stood in the barn and looked at the depleted supply wall. Still more than half of what she'd arranged there. More in the cellar. The notebook, which she took out and reviewed standing up, confirmed that they'd used considerably less than she'd feared, a combination of careful portioning and the storm breaking a day earlier than the worst-case scenario she'd been planning against. The arithmetic, for once, had come out on the right side. She was still looking at the notebook when she heard a horse at the fence. She knew before she turned around. The pattern of his arrivals, always the fence first, always that pause before the gate, was one she had catalogued without meaning to. Harlan Pike tied his horse to the post with the precise movements of a man who is performing calm, and came through the gate and walked toward the barn with his ledger under his arm. He stopped when he reached the barn door and took in the interior, the lamp still burning, the organized supply wall, the reinforced framing, the clean straw, the animals intact in their stalls. His face did the thing it sometimes did when he encountered something he hadn't fully prepared for, a slight recalibration, like a clock adjusting for the wrong temperature. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Pike." He looked at the supply wall for a longer moment than was polite. "I've been riding the township this morning. Assessing damage," he said. Assessing damage the way he said most things, as if the words were doing 2 jobs, describing the action and establishing his authority to perform it. Hollowell's barn lost the north face of the roof. Mabry's root cellar sustained some water intrusion, as I understand it. Widow Crane came through, but she's in a difficult position with fuel. He paused. "Your barn appears to be sound." "It is." The repairs held. They did. He looked at the framing on the north wall. Whatever he'd expected to find collapse, damage, evidence that the skepticism had been justified, wasn't here. She could see the slight discomfort of that in the set of his jaw. "Your hired man did good work," he said, and the effort the admission cost him was audible. "Yes," she said. "He did." He opened his ledger. Old habit, probably. The ledger was the thing he reached for when he needed to feel oriented. Your account, I'd like to settle it, she said. He looked up. In full, she said. Today, if you can arrange the paperwork. He stood very still. You don't have... I have the means, she said. I'd like the account closed. She paused. And I'd like a receipt. He was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. She watched him process it. Not just the information itself, but what it meant about the 3 years of conversations he'd conducted from a position of financial advantage, and the adjustments required now. Harlan Pike was a pragmatist above all else. She'd always understood that about him. He didn't hold grudges when they became impractical. I'll bring the papers this afternoon, he said. Fine. Closed the ledger. He was about to turn when he stopped, and for a moment he looked less like Harlan Pike the merchant, and more like a man who has spent several hours riding through storm damage and arrived at a place that wasn't damaged and is sitting with what that means. Mabry told me, he said. About the cellar. What you did with it. Mara said nothing. He said you could have kept it, that there was enough to see yourself through twice over, and you chose not to. He looked at her with the expression of someone revising a long-held position and not entirely enjoying the process. I want you to know that I understand I was... He stopped, started again. I said you had poor judgment about Rourke, about the situation. I was calculating risk incorrectly. It was not, she reflected, the warmest apology she'd ever received, but it was a real one, which was rarer and more valuable than warmth. Sit down, she said. I'll get you something warm before you ride back. He blinked. He hadn't expected that either. He sat down on the feed crate like a man who wasn't entirely sure his legs had agreed to the decision, and Mara went to the small stove and heated the last of the morning's broth and handed him a cup without ceremony, and he took it with both hands and drank. Caleb came in from the chicken run while Pike was still sitting there, which Mara hadn't planned and couldn't have arranged better if she'd tried. He walked in with his tools under his arm and came up short at the sight of the merchant sitting in the barn with a cup of broth, and the moment held, the two men looking at each other with everything that had been said about both of them in the past 3 weeks. In the past 3 weeks sitting between them, like furniture. Caleb set down his tools. Pike said, Your repairs held. Caleb said, The framing was sound. The northeast joint was the worry, but it seated correctly. Mabry says, You knew the storm was coming before anyone else. The signs were there. I'd seen them before. Pike nodded slowly. Kind of nod that means something is being filed away. Finished his broth, set the cup down with a care that was almost formal, and stood up. I'll bring the papers this afternoon, he said again, to Mara, and then to Caleb, with the particular difficulty of a man who finds this type of thing foreign. He left. Caleb watched the door close and then looked at Mara. That was unexpected, he said. People surprise you, she said, when they've had enough of being wrong. He almost smiled. Not quite Caleb Rourke's almost smiles were the most smiles she usually got, and she'd started to understand them as the real version rather than a lesser one. Then he picked up his tools and went to check the south stall, because there was always something that needed checking. The afternoon brought Ruth Tanner. Ruth arrived not with concern or the friendly delivery of it, but with a covered pot of something that turned out to be beef stew, with the actual flavor of beef rather than the suggestion of it, which meant she'd used her reserves, which meant she was making a statement without saying it directly. She set the pot on Mara's kitchen table. Mara had moved back into the house after a morning of assessment and some very cold work resealing the boarded window from the inside, and looked around the kitchen with the frank inventory of a woman who has been worried about a specific person and is now checking her assessment against reality. You're all right, she said. It was not quite a question. I'm all right, Mara said. Ruth sat down without being asked. There's talk, she said. There's always talk. This is different talk. Ruth folded her hands on the table. People came through your barn. 4 days of it. They're going home to damage and loss, and they're talking about what they found here. What you did. What Rourke did. She paused. I want you to know that I was one of the people who said things I shouldn't have. About your judgment. About the situation with him and the children. Ruth, let me finish. Ruth was not always easy to be around, but she was honest, which was worth more than easy. I said you were being reckless. I said it was unwise and that it reflected poorly on your consideration of your own position. I was wrong about that. I was calculating from fear, which is the same mistake we all made, and you were calculating from something else. I don't know what to call it exactly. Mara looked at her. I just needed the barn fixed, she said. Ruth gave her a look that said she knew that wasn't the whole of it. The widow Crane wants to see you, she said. When you have a moment. She told me to tell you. Ruth stopped. Her expression shifted to something softer, which was rare. She said to tell you that the basket that came on the day before the storm was the thing that made the difference. She had fuel. She was all right. But the basket, the knowing that someone had thought of her, was the thing that made it possible to stay calm when the worst of it came. Ruth's voice was careful now. She's a difficult woman to move. She was moved. Mara looked at the table. She thought about Jonah carrying the basket over to the Crane property on the East Road, his serious, small face above his coat collar, the basket nearly as big as him. He did that, she said. I gave him the basket, but he went on his own. I didn't ask him to check on her. He did it because he thought to. Ruth nodded slowly, absorbing this revision to the story she'd been telling herself about who these people were. The Hollowell brothers want to talk to Rourke, Ruth said, about his methods. The framing. They want to know how the barn stood when theirs didn't. She paused, and I think several families are thinking about their own barns now, their own preparations, asking questions they should have been asking before. She looked at Mara steadily. This is going to change things, the way people see this area, what they think is possible. Mara thought about J, H, and the letter, and the cellar that had been sitting under her barn for decades, waiting for exactly the right, terrible winter. She thought about the seed packets wrapped in oilcloth, on the high shelf, drought-resistant, carefully selected, saved from the best plants of the best years. It was never just my farm, she said. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, with the decisiveness of a woman who has revised her position and is committing to the new one. No, she said. I can see that. Harlan Pike arrived with the papers at 3 o'clock as promised. He was more businesslike this time. The earlier vulnerability sealed back over, but he was efficient and accurate, and the accounting was done correctly, and the receipt was properly written out and signed. And when it was done, Mara held the paper for a moment, this document that erased 3 years of numerical pressure from her daily life, and then folded it and put it in the box where Elias had kept important papers. The box was the one thing she'd moved to the barn before the storm and moved back this morning. It had survived intact. The $47.80 from the cellar covered the debt and left $8 and some cents over, which was not nothing. She'd thought carefully about spending it, specifically about what J, H would have thought about spending it, and had concluded that paying off a debt that threatened the farm's future was exactly what the coins were for. The surplus she put back in the clay jar and returned to the cellar shelf, where it had been, because $8 in reserve was better than the alternative. The days that followed the storm's end had their own particular quality. The strange, buoyant exhaustion of aftermath when the crisis is over, but the body hasn't fully received the news. Mara moved through them, doing what needed doing, helping Caleb patch the chicken run fully, re-inventory the cellar, assess what had been used and what remained, write careful letters to 3 families who'd been in the barn about specific supplies she thought they might need from the cellar stores. She wrote them as offers, not commands. She wrote them as one neighbor to another. She also went to see the widow Crane. Dorothy Crane was 63 years old and had a personality that most of the settlement found difficult. She was direct to the point of seeming rude, did not soften observations for the comfort of their recipients, and had an opinion on everything and expressed it without soliciting interest in whether the opinion was wanted. Mara had always privately liked her for precisely these reasons, and had been keeping her at a distance for the same ones. She arrived at Crane's property on a Thursday morning with 2 wrapped parcels from the Cellarsa smoked fish and dried corn and knocked on the door. Dorothy Crane answered in 30 seconds, which meant she'd seen her coming, which meant she'd been watching for her, Moke. "You came," Crane said. "Ruth said you wanted to see me." "Did." She opened the door wider. The house was small and cold but orderly, every object in its specific place, the table clear, the stove burning with careful economy. Crane sat across the table from her, without ceremony, and said, "The boy brought me a basket." "He thought to," Mara said. "I just provided the contents." "Don't deflect," Crane said. "It was not unkind, it was just direct. You sent him because you were thinking about whether I'd have enough. You were preparing for a storm that wasn't certain yet, and you were thinking about the old woman on the East Road. Own that." Mara looked at her. "All right," she said. "I was thinking about you." Crane nodded. "The basket was cornmeal and salt pork, and there was enough for 8 days, which was 3 more than I needed. I thought about that when the storm was worst. I thought whoever put this together was accounting for worse than I hoped." She paused. "That's sensible thinking. That's the kind of thinking I used to do before I got old and started assuming the next thing would be manageable." She looked at Mara. "I underestimated you for a long time. Not about your farming. I always thought you were more capable than people gave you credit for. About your judgment of people." "You mean Caleb." "I mean the drifter." "Yes." Crane said it without apology. "I thought it was loneliness making you soft. I was wrong about that." Mara thought about how to respond to this and decided that the most honest answer was also the simplest. "I was lonely," she said. "That part you had right. But he showed me in the first 5 minutes that his children came first. That wasn't loneliness talking, that was information." Crane absorbed this. She had the quality of a person who actually listens underneath the exterior that makes people assume she isn't. "He intends to stay?" she said. "I don't know yet. What do you want?" Mara looked at the table. The question was so direct that it caught her somewhere unguarded. What did she want? She had spent 3 years not thinking about what she wanted, because wanting things that weren't certain felt like a risk she couldn't afford. She'd been thinking in terms of what was necessary, what was survivable, what the arithmetic required. "I want the farm to work," she said. "I want to use those seeds in the cellar properly, in the spring. I want to know what JH grew them from and try to do the same." She paused. "I want the children to have a place that's theirs." Crane was quiet for a moment. "That's not all of it," she said. "No," Mara said, "but the rest of it isn't your business." Dorothy Crane's face changed then, just briefly, just a crack in the direct surface. And what came through was something that might have been amusement, or approval, or the expression of a woman recognizing something she hadn't seen in a long time and finding it welcome. "No," she said, "I suppose it isn't." She sent Mara home with a jar of preserved plums and instructions about the best soil drainage on the east-facing slope, which she'd been working for 40 years and knew in ways that no land office survey could account for. The instructions were detailed and specific, given without being asked, which was Dorothy Crane's version of an apology and a welcome offered simultaneously. It was late afternoon when Mara got back. The sky was going pink above the western snow. The kind of color that means cold but also means clear, means the system has passed and left behind the particular sharp beauty that only comes after something difficult. She stood at the fence gate for a moment, looking at the barn. From inside came the sound of hammering. Caleb, finishing something or fixing something. The sounds were different, but she'd been learning to read the difference. This one was finishing. The regular, deliberate cadence of work approaching completion. And from somewhere to the right of that, lower down, a child's voice, Jonah's, then Elsie's, then laughter, which she still wasn't entirely used to from Elsie, who had been so careful with that particular thing when they first arrived. Elsie's laugh was surprised sounding, like she'd forgotten she could make the sound and kept being caught off guard by it. Mara stood at the fence for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went inside. Caleb was at the northeast corner, setting the last piece of trim on the repaired joint, a strip of oak that would hold the plate together through the next season's expansion and contraction. He looked up when she came in took one look at her face, and said, "How was Crane?" "Direct," she said, "as expected." "Did she give you a hard time?" "She gave me plums and soil drainage advice." "That's the same thing from her." He turned back to the joint. "People are changing their minds," he said. "About you. About the situation here." He drove the last nail. "Dale Hollowell came by this afternoon while you were out. Wants to talk about the framing methods. He's going to rebuild his barn roof in the spring, and he wants to do it differently than before. Ruth told me people were asking." He brought his brother. Caleb set down the hammer. They sat in here for an hour asking questions. Good questions. Kind that show they'd been thinking it through before they asked. He turned around. Jonah talked to them too, about what he'd noticed in the construction. Caleb stopped. Something moved in his face that she didn't see there very often. Something unguarded. He talked about it like he knew what he was doing, not like a child reciting what he'd heard. He understood the principles. Mara looked at him. "He's been watching you for 3 weeks." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "He's quick. Quicker than I give him credit for." She thought about Jonah handing tools before they were asked for. Jonah sorting timber by length without instruction. Jonah carrying a basket over a cold road to a difficult old woman because he thought to, because it was the next right thing and nobody needed to tell him that. He learned it somewhere, she said. Caleb looked at her for a second. Then he bent down and picked up his tools. "Elsie's been asking about the chickens," he said. "She wants to know if she can be in charge of them." "Can be in charge of them," I told her I'd ask. You could have just told her yes. He looked at her over his shoulder. "It's your farm." The words landed quietly between them. Farm. The boundary he'd been maintaining for 3 weeks, careful, respectful, real. She'd been aware of it the whole time. The same way you're aware of a fence line in a field. It's doing a job. You understand why it's there. And you can also see past it to what's on the other side. She thought about what Dorothy Crane had said. "What do you want?" She thought about Elias, who had been dead for 3 years, and whose absence had been the largest fact of her life for all of that time. She thought about the farm that had been his dream first, and hers by inheritance, and then hers by survival, and was now slowly becoming something she hadn't quite named yet. She thought about what it meant to have 14 people in your barn for 4 days and come out the other side with something more intact than you'd gone in with. Not just the barn, something else. Something harder to measure. "Caleb," she said. He turned. "The barn is finished." He looked at the joint he'd just set. Looked at the walls, the framing, the roof. "Mostly," he said. "There's still the south brace. And the loft floor has a soft spot I want to reinforce." "For that," she said, "when it's finished." "What were you planning to do?" It was very still for a moment. Not the stillness of a man caught off guard. The stillness of a man who has been waiting for a specific question and has had his answer ready for a while, and is now deciding whether the moment is the right one to give it. "I hadn't decided," he said. Which was not, she noticed. The same as I was planning to leave. She nodded. She wasn't going to push it. She'd asked the question, which was its own kind of step, and she wasn't interested in pressing him into an answer he hadn't fully formed. That was not how she wanted things. "The seeds in the cellar," she said. JH drought-resistant strains. "I want to plant them in the spring, properly, with someone who knows what they're doing." She looked at him. "You grew up farming before the building?" "Kansas." "Yes." "Then you know how to read soil." "I do." "Good," she said, and she went to the stove to start supper, because there was always supper to start, and the children would be in soon, and tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, and the important things had been said clearly enough for now. Behind her, she heard Caleb put his tools down on the workbench, heard the barn settle in the evening cold, the specific sounds of a structure that has been through something and come out holding, heard Elsie's voice outside, closer now, talking to the chickens, the way she'd started doing 2 days ago, a steady soft narration that the birds seemed to find acceptable. Outside, the last of the afternoon light lay across the snow in long blue shadows. The road still buried, still impassable in places, would open up in a few days, and then the spring would come, and then the seeds in the cellar would go into the ground, and then something would grow that hadn't grown on this land before. And the woman everyone had watched fail for 3 years, the woman they'd calculated against and counseled toward surrender and warned about her poor judgment, was standing at the stove in her kitchen, making supper for 4, with a cleared debt and a standing barn, and a notebook full of careful records, and the first real sense in a long time that she knew exactly what this land was for. She was not done being afraid. She was not done making mistakes. She was not even close to finished with the hard years that the frontier had in store for anyone foolish or stubborn enough to stay on it. But she was still here. The barn was still standing. And the cellar was still stocked with seeds that someone had saved from the best plants of the best years, for exactly the right person, in exactly the right season. That was enough for tonight. The South Brace took Caleb 4 days to finish properly. He could have done it in 2. Mara suspected, but he was being thorough in the way he got, when he was thinking about something else, working with more deliberateness than the task strictly required. Measuring twice, standing back, measuring again. She recognized this quality in him now. She'd been learning him the way you learn a piece of land, slowly, by walking it in different weather, noting what changed and what stayed constant. She didn't ask what he was thinking about. She had her own thinking to do. January settled over the Nebraska territory with the flat, committed cold that follows a bad storm. Not dramatic, just permanent feeling, the kind of winter that stops trying to impress you and simply installs itself. The snow that had buried the fence line consolidated into a hard crust that crunched underfoot and reflected the low sun in ways that made your eyes ache. The road reopened by the 5th day after the storm, when Dale Hollowell and his brother came through with shovels and the 2 heaviest horses in the settlement. And then people began to move again. Tentatively at first, and then with the returning momentum of a community getting back to itself. What came with that returning momentum was something Mara hadn't entirely anticipated, though she should have. People kept coming to the barn, not in crisis, not in need of shelter or supplies, not with the specific desperation of the storm's worst days. They came the way people come to a place that has become something in their minds. A place that means something it didn't mean before. Dale Hollowell came twice more to talk to Caleb about framing methods, and brought a neighbor named Prescott who was planning to build in the spring. Deacon Mabry came and spent an afternoon in the cellar with Mara, not taking anything but cataloging. What was there with the organized thoroughness of a man applying a skill he actually had, and then sat at her kitchen table and drew up what he called a community inventory plan, which families had what surplus, which had shortfalls. Shared emergency store for the settlement might look like if people contributed to it proportionally. It was, Mara thought, exactly the kind of thing she would have rolled her eyes at from Mabry 6 months ago. She did not roll her eyes at it now. She sat across the table from him and read the document he drafted and made 3 specific corrections which he accepted without argument, and they talked for 2 hours about what was possible and what wasn't, and where the lines between them were genuinely uncertain. "You've changed," she said at one point, not as a compliment exactly, just as an observation. He looked at her. 4 days in your barn will do that, he said. Watching someone manage 14 scared people with a notebook and calm mathematics, he stopped. It adjusts your view of certain things. Your view of women managing things, specifically. He had the grace to hold her gaze. Yes, he said. Specifically. She nodded and went back to the document. Ruth Tanner reorganized her school to include 2 additional days per week. Citing enrollment increases several families had apparently decided in the wake of the storm. Question of whether their children could read and calculate was more urgent than they'd treated it before. She asked Mara if Jonah and Elsie could continue attending permanently, and framed it as a benefit to the school rather than a concession to their situation, which was the kindest version of the offer she could have constructed, and which Mara appreciated more than she said. Jonah took to the school with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything. He was behind in some subjects. He'd moved too many times for his education to be consistent, but he was quick in a way that Ruth described to Mara as almost unsettling. The kind of quick that meant he was working through the material rather than just receiving it. Within 3 weeks, he was helping the younger children with their arithmetic, not because Ruth asked him to, but because he'd noticed they were struggling, and it seemed like the next useful thing. Elsie was different. Elsie came to school and sat very still and watched everything with those enormous dark eyes and produced work that was technically correct and revealed almost nothing about what was happening inside her. Ruth said she was bright but guarded, which Mara already knew, and that she seemed to be waiting for something, which Mara was starting to understand. What Elsie was waiting for was the thing none of them had said out loud yet. It was Elsie who finally said it. She said it on a Saturday afternoon in late January, when Caleb was outside and Jonah was at Ruth's house, and Mara was at the kitchen table with her seed catalog and her notebook, planning the spring planting with the methodical pleasure of someone who has not been able to think about the future in a long time, and is now allowing herself to. Elsie came and stood in the kitchen doorway in the particular way she had, not hovering, not demanding, just present, waiting to see if she was welcome. "Come in," Mara said. "You don't have to stand there." Elsie came in and sat in the chair across from her and looked at the seed catalog for a moment. Then she said without preamble, "Are we staying?" Mara set down her pencil. The question was so quiet and so direct, and so clearly the result of a long internal deliberation that it required an answer of the same quality, not reassurance. Elsie Rourke was not a child who was comforted by reassurance. She was a child who wanted information. "I don't know yet," Mara said. "That depends on some things your father and I haven't talked about directly." Elsie absorbed this. "He wants to stay," she said. "He doesn't say it, but I can tell by how he works. When we're about to leave a place, he works differently, faster and less careful. He's been slow and careful here." Mara looked at this 7-year-old child who had learned to read her father's intentions through the quality of his carpentry and felt something move in her chest that was too complicated to name quickly. "That's good information," she said. "Are you going to ask him?" "I think he needs to ask me," Mara said. Elsie considered this. She had that quality of consideration that made talking to her feel different than talking to other childrenless. Like you were managing the conversation and more like you were having it. "Why?" she said. Mara thought about how to explain the particular calculus of two people who have both been through enough loss to approach the next thing carefully, who have been living in close proximity for months and have been conducting a very slow, very deliberate negotiation through gesture and work, and the occasional sentence that means more than it says. She thought about how to explain that to a 7-year-old. "Because this is his decision to make," she said, "and I want him to make it when he's ready, not because I pushed." Elsie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll tell him you want him to ask." "Elsie, not in those words," Elsie said, with the faint trace of something that was almost dry, almost the shape of her father's almost smile in a younger face. "I'll tell him in a way that makes him think he figured it out himself." Mara stared at her. "You're 7 years old," she said. "I know," Elsie said, as if this were mildly inconvenient. Mara picked up her pencil. She looked at the seed catalog. She said very carefully, "The drought-resistant corn. I want to plant it in the east field. Dorothy Crane says the drainage there is better than it looks." Elsie nodded, apparently satisfied that the conversation had concluded correctly, and went to check on the chickens. Caleb asked her 3 days later. He did not do it dramatically. He was at the workbench in the barn, sorting the remaining tools from the cellar. They'd decided to properly clean and oil everything and make an organized inventory of what was there. And Mara was across from him with the notebook. And the afternoon was quiet, except for the wind against the boards and Agnes moving in her stall. "I want to talk about the spring," he said. "All right," she said. "Planting." He set down the draw knife he'd been cleaning. "You've got the seed catalog and Crane's drainage information. You need someone who knows how to read soil conditions and manage the planting properly if you're going to do those strains justice. He looked at her. I grew up doing that work. I know how to do it. I know, she said. I'm saying I could stay and do it. Through the planting season at minimum. He paused. Barn is finished. The terms of our arrangement are complete. So I'm not... This isn't me saying I owe you more. This is me asking about something different. She kept her eyes on the notebook. What are you asking, Caleb? A long pause. Outside, Agnes shifted, and the wind said something against the northwest wall. And somewhere Elsie was talking to the chickens in her low, steady narration. I'm asking if this is somewhere we could make a life, he said. The three of us, with the two of you. If that's... He stopped. Could hear him choosing. If that's something you'd want. She looked up. He was watching her with the direct, tired eyes that she'd been learning for months. The eyes that didn't perform and didn't hide and were, she'd come to believe, one of the most honest things she'd encountered in a long time. Yes, she said. Simply. Because it was simple, even if everything around it was complicated. He nodded. He didn't say anything immediately, which was his way. Then I should tell you something about Kansas, about why we left. You don't have to, I want to. He sat down on the bench. My wife died in the spring of '81. Fever, it took her fast 10 days from the first sign to the end. After that, I couldn't. The farm was hers as much as mine in every way that mattered, and I couldn't make it feel like the right place anymore. He looked at his hands. I tried for a year. Jonah was 8. Elsie was 6. I tried to make it work for them. But the neighbors, the town, they'd known us together, and they didn't quite know how to know me alone. And there were some debts. Decisions I'd made badly after she died, when I wasn't thinking clearly. I cleared most of them before we left, but not all. He paused. There's no one coming after us, if that's what you're wondering. Debts are old enough and small enough that they've moved on. But I wanted you to know the full shape of it. Mara set down the notebook. What was her name? He looked up, slightly surprised. People usually asked about the debts. Clara, he said. Was she good? She was the best person I've known. He said it without hesitation, which was the right way to say it, and she felt no particular difficulty hearing it, because it was honest, and because she understood it. Elias had been the best person she'd known, too. That was not a competition, and it was not an obstacle. It was just the true shape of two people who had loved well and lost, and were somehow still here, in a barn in Nebraska, sorting tools and talking about the spring planting. Elias died in the spring of '81 too, she said. Accident with the plow. He was 41 years old. Caleb said nothing. He just let that sit between them, which was the right thing to do. We have that in common, she said. Among other things. He nodded. After a moment, he reached across the bench and picked up the draw knife again and went back to cleaning it, because that was how both of them dealt with the large things, by returning to the work, by letting the hands do something while the larger part of the mind settled. They sat in the barn for another hour in a silence that was different from before. Not the watchful silence of the early weeks, not the functional silence of crisis. Something quieter and more permanent. February brought the community meeting. It was Mabry's idea, technically, but Mara had been the one who'd suggested the framework when he'd shown her his inventory document, and it was her barn now fully repaired, the south brace set, the loft floor reinforced, the whole structure standing with a solidity it hadn't had in years that hosted it. 14 families. Not all of them had been in the barn during the storm, but enough of those who had been had talked to. Enough of those who hadn't, that everyone had some version of the story. Mara had not intended to speak at the meeting. She'd intended to host it, which was different, to provide the space and the warmth in the organization, and let Mabry do the talking, because Mabry was better at meetings than she was, and she had no particular interest in standing in front of 14 families and being looked at. The meeting had been going for 20 minutes when Dale Hollowell said, specifically, I'd like to hear from Mrs. Whitlock about the cellar, and 14 faces turned to her, and there was nothing to do but talk. She told the story the same way she'd been telling it, plainly, without embellishment, beginning with Caleb finding the trapdoor and ending with the letter which she'd brought and read aloud in full. The room was quiet while she read it. To whoever finds this place in a time of need, I built this not for myself, but for the trouble I knew was coming. I have watched enough winters on this land to know that the worst one always arrives when you are least prepared. What is here is not mine to keep. It belongs to whoever needs it most when the sky turns against you. Use it well. Share it if you can. There is enough if you are careful. She folded the letter and looked at the room. 14 families looking back at her, with the particular expression of people encountering something. They don't have a category for something that doesn't fit neatly into the existing language of prairie life, which ran primarily to self-reliance and calculation, and the keeping of what you'd worked for. Who was Jay? Someone asked. A woman in the back whose name Mara didn't know. I don't know, Mara said. I've been through every land record at the county office. Nobody with those initials appears to have held this land before Elias purchased it in '78. Either the record is incomplete, or J.H. built the cellar on someone else's claim, or she stopped. I may never know. I've decided that's all right. What do you mean, all right? Hollowell said, not challenging, genuinely asking. I mean, the point of the thing wasn't to be known. Point was to do it. She paused. That's the part I keep coming back to. Somebody built that room with no expectation of credit and no certainty that anyone would ever use it properly. Just built it and left. The room was quiet again. Outside, the February wind said the same things it always said, but the barn absorbed it now without complaint, the walls doing the job they'd been rebuilt to do. Mabry's community plan was adopted, with modifications from 3 different families who had better ideas about specific details than he'd had, which Mara thought was the best possible outcome collective improvement on a good starting point rather than wholesale rejection of it or uncritical acceptance. They agreed on a shared emergency supply agreement. Each family would contribute proportionally to a communal store, managed by a rotating committee, inspected twice a year. The store would be housed, for now, in the cellar under Mara Whitlock's Barnan arrangement she'd proposed herself and which was accepted, without anyone finding it strange, which meant the settlement's understanding of her and her property had shifted considerably since October. Caleb sat in the back of the room throughout the meeting and said almost nothing. At one point, Dale Hollowell asked him directly about the framing techniques, and he answered in the specific, practical language of someone who knows a subject well. Not performing expertise, just sharing it. And 3 men made notes on scraps of paper. At the end of the meeting, Prescott, the man who was building in the spring, came and shook his hand and asked if he'd be willing to consult on the framing for a price. Caleb said he'd think about it. Mara from across the room did not look at him, but she heard the exchange and the particular quality of his "I'll think about it" was not a no. That evening, after the families had filed out and the barn was quiet again, Jonah swept the floor with the methodical efficiency of a boy who knew that someone had to do it and had decided it would be him. Elsie organized the chairs they'd borrowed from the Tanner house into a stack for return. Caleb checked the stove damper. Mara blew out 3 of the 4 lamps. In the remaining lamplight, standing in the barn that had survived the worst storm in 20 years, Mara looked at the 4 of them performing these small, ordinary tasks, and she thought, this is what it looks like before it becomes a memory. Before the distance that time puts between you and a moment makes it into something with meaning. Now, it was just a swept floor and stacked chairs and a damper adjusted properly. Someday, it would be the beginning of something. She thought about writing to Nettie Frost to see how she'd gotten on in Callaway. She thought about the spring seed order, which needed to go out by the end of February if they wanted the right quantities. She thought about Dorothy Crane's drainage maps and what the east field would look like by June, if the planting went the way she was planning it. She thought about Jonah, who would be 10 by April and who needed. She had been thinking, a real set of woodworking tools of his own, rather than borrowing from his father every time he had an idea he wanted to build. She thought about all of these things, and none of them felt like burdens. Spring came the way. Spring always comes on the Nebraska frontier, arguing with winter for 3 weeks before winter agreed to leave, and then arriving all at once with a rush of cold water and mud and the smell of soil that had been locked under ice since October. The snow melted in stages, roof first, then the hard crust on the fields, then the road, then the stubborn drifts in the north corners of everything, which held until April, because the sun never quite reached them directly. Cellar seeds went into the ground on a Thursday, in late April, after 2 weeks of soil preparation that Caleb and Mara had worked through, together testing the drainage Crane had described, amending where needed, laying out the rows with the careful spacing the seed packet specified in J.H.U.'s faded handwriting. They worked side by side in the field the way people work when they've learned each other's rhythms, not needing to talk through every decision, just moving in the same direction with the occasional exchange when the decision wasn't obvious. Jonah worked the north end of the field with his own row markers, which he'd made himself from leftover barn timber cut to precise lengths and pointed with the draw knife his father had given him in March. He'd measured them with a level, which nobody had told him to do, and the row spacing on his section was more exact than the adults. Elsie planted the kitchen garden near the house, her project, her territory, approached with the organizational seriousness she brought to everything. She'd made a map of it in her school notebook, a careful drawing with each crop labeled and its companion plants noted, and the sun angles marked by hour, based on 2 weeks of observation she'd apparently been conducting without announcing. Ruth Tanner had seen the map and told Mara about it with the expression of someone who is revising their estimates of a person. Community work parties started in May. The first one was at the Hollowell property, the new barn roof, built using the framing principles Caleb had shared at the February meeting. 8 men came, including Caleb and Jonah and Garrett Cole, who had eventually explained that he'd come to settle near his brother and had done so, and his brother's farm was 4 miles east and doing tolerably. They worked 2 full days, and the new roof went up cleaner and stronger than what the storm had taken. The second work party was at the widow Crane's property, where the chimney had been drawing poorly for 2 years, a problem she'd been managing around rather than solving, with the particular stubbornness of a person who has decided that asking for help is less acceptable than enduring the inconvenience. It took Mabry and Ruth Tanner and Mara together to persuade her to accept the party, and even then Dorothy Crane spent the first hour of the work standing at the edge of it with her arms crossed, and an expression that was only slightly less hostile than refusal. By the second hour, she was directing operations in a way that was technically staying out of it, and by the afternoon, she was handing tools and making the particular dry observations that were her version of humor. When the chimney was done and the men were packing up, she came to Mara and said, without ceremony, "Tell Rourke his son's row spacing was better than his." "I'll tell him," Mara said. Crane nodded. She looked at the barn across the road for a moment. Her barn, which had held through the storm, which had not needed work parties because she'd been maintaining it with grim precision for 40 years. She looked at it with the expression of a woman who keeps her own counsel, but occasionally lets something through. That JH knew what they were doing, she said. They did. The drought-resistant corn. What just selected for? She looked at Mara. I've been thinking about those strains. If they yield the way the variety suggests, you'll have surplus by August. I'm counting on it. You'll want to save the best of it for next year's seed. She paused. And you'll want to share the knowledge of which plants to save from. Not just the harvest. She looked at Mara with the direct eyes that missed very little. That's what Jay understood. It wasn't just the food, the knowing how. You give someone a crock of beans, and you feed them for a winter. You give them the seed and the knowledge of how to save it. She stopped. Well, Mara agreed. The summer was not easy. No summer on the Nebraska frontier was easy. but it was workable in a way the previous 3 hadn't been. The east field came up better than expected. The drought-resistant varieties held through a dry June with minimal stress, and by July they were looking at a yield that would not just replace what the October frost had killed, but exceed it. Kitchen garden produced with the enthusiasm of well-planned soil, and Elsie managed it with an attention to detail that kept it productive past the point where most kitchen gardens started flagging. Mara canned with a focus and efficiency that filled the cellar shelves, the community cellar shelves now, shared and cataloged and inspected to a level that looked nothing like the desperate 6-week calculation of the previous October. Caleb consulted on 3 building projects in the township through the summer months, taking payment in a combination of cash and trade goods, which was the standard arrangement, and which meant that by August he had contributed materially to the farm's income in ways that had nothing to do with the debt of the original barn repair. He mentioned this to Mara once, in the context of wanting to be clear that his presence was a contribution and not a continuation of obligation. "I know that," she said. "I know you know," he said. I wanted to say it. She understood. He was a man who needed his accounts to be clear, not out of pride exactly, but out of the same precision he brought to framing and soil preparation. He wanted the terms of things to be accurate, because inaccurate terms led to misunderstandings, and misunderstandings led to the kind of damage that was harder to repair than a barn wall. "Then it's," she said. He nodded, and they went back to whatever they'd been doing. Question of marriage came up the way most of the important things came up between them, since sideways, through practical context in the middle of something else. It was an August evening, and they were sitting on the porch, a proper porch now, which Caleb had added to the south side of the house in late June, because the south side got the best evening light, and there was no reason not to use it. And going long and gold across the field, and the corn was visible in its rows, and the barn was solid against the darkening sky. Jonah and Elsie were inside. Mara could hear them. Jonah reading aloud from the book Ruth Tanner had lent him. Elsie making occasional corrections to his pronunciation, with the precision of a child who has read further ahead than he has. "People are going to keep assuming," Caleb said, without prelude. He said it the way he said most things, as a fact that had been on his mind and was now being offered for consideration. "They already assume," Mara said. "I know." He paused. "I want to ask you properly. I wasn't sure about the timing, but I think the timing has been right for a while now, and I've been cautious for my own reasons." "I know your reasons," she said. "Then you know they're not about you." "I know." She looked at the corn in the evening light. "Yes," she said, "ask me properly." He turned and looked at her with the steady, direct eyes she'd been learning since October. The eyes that were tired in a way that wasn't going to go away, but were also, she'd come to believe, one of the most reliable things she'd ever encountered. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not as a bargain, not as an arrangement, because I want to spend my life on this land with you, and I believe you want the same." "I do," she said, simple and true. He put his hand over hers on the porch rail. He left it there. They sat in the evening light and didn't say anything else for a while, because there was nothing else that needed saying, and the silence had earned the right to just be quiet. Inside, Jonah's reading voice continued steadily. Elsie corrected something. A brief exchange, then Jonah's voice again better now, finding the rhythm, learning. The wedding was in September, 10 days before the anniversary of Caleb's arrival at the fence. Ruth Tanner organized it because Ruth Tanner organized things, and Mara accepted her help with more grace than she'd have managed a year ago, which was itself a kind of change worth noting. Dorothy Crane came and stood in the front row and said nothing critical about the ceremony, which was her version of enthusiastic approval. Deacon Mabry presided in his official capacity, and if the experience of doing so for a woman he'd called poor judging 6 months ago produced any irony in his expression, he was decent enough to keep it to himself. Jonah wore the new shirt Mara had made him for the occasion, and held himself with the serious dignity of a boy. who understood that this moment was significant and was giving it the appropriate weight. He had grown 3 inches since October, which meant he was going to be tall, which meant he was going to look like his father in a way that was already becoming apparent in the set of his jaw and the economy of his movement. Elsie wore a dress that Ruth Tanner's eldest daughter had outgrown, and which fit almost right, almost but not quite, in the particular way of children's clothes at the boundary of sizes. She stood beside Jonah and watched the proceedings with those serious dark eyes, and when it was done she came and took Mara's hand briefly, not dramatically, not with the scene a different child might have made of it, just held it for a moment. Then she let and went to find the chickens who had been moved to the yard for the occasion and were making their opinions known. Community gathered on the farm that afternoon. 14 families, plus Dorothy Crane, plus Garrett O'Cole and his brother and sister-in-law, plus Nettie Frost, who had written back to Mara's letter in March and had settled in Callaway with the woman Mara had recommended, and was, she said, getting on. She'd come the distance for the occasion with her infant. No longer an infant, actually a solid, determined 10-month-old, who was trying very hard to walk and mostly succeeding. She handed the baby to Jonah at one point, who held him with the confidence of a child who has had sufficient practice at useful things, and the baby looked at him with the focused evaluation of a very small person making a social assessment, and then apparently decided he was acceptable and grabbed a fistful of Jonah's collar. People ate in the yard and in the barn and on the new porch, and the light went long and warm over the field and the corn. H's corn. Mara had started thinking of it, though it was hers now stood in its rows with the fullness of a good harvest, ready for the next week's work. The best plants had been flagged already, waiting to have their seed saved, waiting to become next year's planting, and the year after, and the year after that, Harlan Pike came. He came at the end, as the light was failing, and brought a jar of good coffee beans, which was a more generous gift than was strictly required, and which she accepted without commentary. He shook Caleb's hand with the formality of a man who is doing something that doesn't come naturally, but has decided it needs doing, and Caleb shook his hand back with the directness of a man who holds no particular grudge because holding grudges requires energy better, spent elsewhere. They spoke for a few minutes about the fall market prices and the road improvements that were being discussed for the Eastern County Road, which was as close to ordinary conversation as two such different men could reasonably achieve, and Mara found that she was glad Harlan Pike had come, which was not something she'd have predicted in October. There is something about a hard year, the kind that strips things down to essentials and makes you look at what's actually there, that has the potential to move people. Not everyone, and not automatically, and the movement is rarely dramatic or complete. Most people only shift a little, but a little, for some of them, turns out to be enough. Mara had been thinking about this since February, since the meeting in the barn, since the first work party at the Hollowell place. She'd been thinking about J.H. and the letter, and what it meant to prepare for something you wouldn't live to see. She'd been thinking about the seeds, not just the corn, but the larger idea of seeds, things you plant knowing the harvest belongs to someone else, deeds whose consequences run longer than the person who does them. Kind of investment in the future that requires you to trust the future, even when you have no evidence it deserves the trust. She didn't know J.H.'s name. She still didn't know, and probably never would. But she knew the quality of their thinking, the care of the selection, the rightness of the preparation, the particular faith embedded in the letter. Share it if you can. There is enough if you are careful. The careful part was important. It had always been the careful part that mattered. Not the generosity alone. Generosity without management was waste. But the combination of open hands and clear thinking, the willingness to give and the discipline to give wisely. Mara had been learning that combination for 34 years, and she was still learning it. She thought she'd be learning it until the end. She thought J.H. had probably felt the same way. At the end of the evening, When the last of the families had headed home, and the yard was quiet except for the wind in the corn and the particular sounds a farm makes settling into its night routines, Mara stood at the fence, where Caleb had stood 10 months ago, thin and gaunt, and carefully not asking for more than survival, and looked at what the year had made. Barn stood solid in the dark. The house behind it had a proper porch on the south side, and a window that was properly sealed, and a kitchen that had fed 14 people for 4 days with what was in the cellar, and had not run short. The cellar itself had been organized and restocked through the summer's work, the shelves filled in a different way, now filled by many hands, many families, many different contributions, organized by the committee that Mabry had helped establish, and that actually worked because Mara had insisted it include Dorothy Crane, who made things work through the force of her exacting precision. She heard the door behind her. Caleb came and stood beside her at the fence, the way he had in October, when they'd first looked at the damage the storm left. He looked at the same things she was looking at: the barn, the field, the road that ran south toward the rest of the settlement. It was a scrape. He didn't say anything, which was right. This was not a moment that needed words. It was a moment that needed two people standing in it together and letting it be what it was. Then, from somewhere behind them, Elsie's voice: "Are the chickens supposed to be in the yard still?" Caleb turned. Jonah was supposed to put them in. Jonah says he did. The chickens disagree. A pause. Then Caleb went around the side of the house to address the chickens' opinions, and Mara stood at the fence for another moment alone, looking at the barn. She thought about the woman she'd been in October, standing in a field of dead wheat with Harlan Pike's ledger scratch in her ears and 6 weeks of cornmeal between her and nothing. She thought about how close that had been, how the distance between despair and survival is sometimes exactly the width of an unexpected decision. A gate opened, a bowl of food, a stranger's offer of labor, a trap door in a dirt floor, a letter from someone who died before she was born and had somehow left her exactly what she needed. Thought about the fact that none of it, not the cellar, not the seeds, not the barn surviving, not the 14 families fed through the storm, not any of it had been planned. She had not planned to open the gate. She had not planned to say, "Come inside." She had not planned to find a trap door or a letter, or the particular rightness of a man who fed his children first. She had planned the portions and the inventory and the careful notebook mathematics, yes, but the original decision, that had not been planning. That had been something older and less rational than planning. That had been the instinct of a woman who was out of good options and had decided to act from something other than calculation. She was glad she had. The chickens were brought in, eventually, after a negotiation involving all 4 of them and the last of the evening's light and 1 hen, who had opinions about the matter and was willing to defend them. By the time the barn was closed and the lamp was lit and the supper things were done and the children were in the loft, the farm had settled into its ordinary nighttime self, and ordinary was the best thing it could possibly be. That night, with the wind working softly at the new porch boards and the corn standing in its rows in the dark outside, Mara lay awake for a while in the particular way that is not quite the same as not sleeping. The way of someone whose mind is full but not troubled, running through the day's sounds and faces and the quality of the light keeping them. She thought about one more thing before she slept. She thought about Elsie's question back in January. The direct, quiet, 7-year-old question that had cut through everything. Are we staying? The answer, it turned out, was larger than yes or no. The answer was, we are building something that requires us to stay. We are planting seeds that need us to be here for the harvest. We are managing a cellar that belongs to more than us, and therefore tethers us to more than ourselves. We are the continuation of something that started before we arrived, and which will continue after we're gone, because that is the nature of things that are built well and passed forward with care. The answer was, this is what staying looks like, when staying is chosen rather than defaulted into. When you decide that a place is worth the cost of your full self, your planning, and your impulse, and your grief, and your cautious hope, and your willingness to open the gate to a man at the fence who might be exactly what he says he is. She had opened the gate. Everything else had followed from that. Outside, the wind dropped to almost nothing, the way it does in September on the Nebraska frontier, when the season has begun its turn, and the air is feeling its way towards something colder, and the stars are very clear above the cornfield, above the barn, above the fence where a gaunt stranger had once stood with two hungry children and said, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I can work. I can fix what's broken." He had. He had fixed what was broken, and so had she, and the difference between what the farm had been in October and what it was now was not a miracle or a stroke of fortune. It was the accumulation of small right decisions made by imperfect people in difficult circumstances, one after another, the course of a year, that had tried very hard to be the worst year of their lives, and had ended up being the year that everything finally began. The lamp went out. The farm was quiet. The seeds in the cellar waited for spring.